Welcome to the Vaccine Hesitancy podcast. I'm Dr. Ty Branch, a researcher with the concept team at the University of Cologne. I'm also a member of the Moral Obligation, Epistemology, and Public Health Research Group examining vaccine hesitancy. The aim of our research group is to inform discussion about the ethics and rationality of vaccine hesitancy. To help us reflect on this, today our guest is Dr. Kristen Intemann from Montana State University. Welcome, Dr. Intemann.
Hi, so thank you so much for having me. It's great to be a part of this series, and thank you for all the work you're doing on these important topics that, are not only sort of philosophically interesting, but also have real practical importance for society. So my name is Kristen Intemann. I am a professor of philosophy at Montana State University, where I also direct the Center for Science, Technology, Ethics, and Society. And I work primarily in issues around values in science and science communication and public engagement and public trust. And so for me, all of those are very sort of interconnected. There's been a long body of scholarship looking at how values might play a role in science. I've contributed to that through my work, arguing that values can play not only necessary role in some areas of scientific inquiry, but also a desirable role kind of all throughout the research process in framing research questions, in thinking about what kind of data we might want to collect in a particular context. In some instances, even on what's the best way to characterize or interpret that data. Heather Douglas and others have argued that inductive risk is another place where values play a role. So in thinking about what sorts of risks are acceptable when we accept or reject a hypothesis, and how much evidence we need for those sorts of things. So lots of my work has looked at specific examples of when and how that occurs. And it's also tied to work I've done on dissent and consensus in a couple of ways. So one is, philosophers of science kind of face this question, which is, if values do play a positive role in science, if we abandon the kind of value-free ideal of science, then how transparent should we be with the public and laypersons about that? That is, will making value judgments transparent make people even more hesitant to trust science or accept scientific conclusions? On the other hand, if we obscure or kind of hide the role that values plays, then that also denies people the opportunity to, to be able to disagree with those values, to think about whether or not those are the values that should be driving science.
Okay, so let me pick out on a specific thing that you said. You brought up the term dissent. And for a lot of cases, when we think of science, we think of consensus. So, what is dissent in science and what role does it serve?
So, especially in my work with Immaculata de Melo-Martin, we use dissent in a very specific way. So, dissent refers to, a dissenting view against a fairly well-established scientific consensus. Um, so, there's, so for example, with the MMR vaccine, the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine, there is a very broad consensus that that vaccine is safe and highly effective for measles, mumps, and rubella, for example. And so a dissenting view would be one that challenged in some way, shape, or form that consensus view. Now, there's also what we would call disagreement, scientific disagreement, which tends to arise in cases where there's not a consensus. So we saw that a lot in the COVID-19 pandemic, because that was a case where, it was a novel coronavirus. In the early stages, there was a lot of disagreement about, how it was spread, the mortality rate, for example, who was most at risk. Now we've moved to consensus on some of those issues, but it took time. And at the beginning, there was a lot of disagreement. Now, we might think that dissent against a scientific consensus is not very helpful at all because, if especially if you do think that the aim of science is to get towards consensus and that the achievement of consensus is an indication that the knowledge is quite reliable, because otherwise it would be sort of a coincidence, a surprising coincidence that experts came to the same conclusion. Um, but even in those cases where there is a well established scientific consensus, dissent can play a very valuable role. In some instances, even though there was broad agreement on things, broad consensus, it turned out that the dissenting view was right or partly right. And you can see that in the history of science, for example, with the discovery of H. pylori bacteria. I mean, there was a broad consensus that bacteria simply could not grow in a high acidity in highly acidic environment, and so they were convinced that these crazy people that supposedly found this new bacteria in the stomach that was perhaps the cause of peptic ulcers, that they must be wrong, right? And it took a very long time, and they were very persistent until this consensus actually changed. So that's an example where dissent can play a really important role in kind of just ensuring that we have the right view. And dissent can also open up new avenues of research. So, for example, in the earlier days of criticisms of the MMR vaccine, you had all these people worried that there was some connection between that vaccine and autism, for example. And although it turned out that that was wrong, and that there's no evidence of a connection between autism and the MMR vaccine, it actually spurred research that hadn't been done. Because the truth was, when those claims started being made, researchers didn't really know. That wasn't ever something they had sort of looked for. And so it actually spurred a ton of research into whether there could be a connection. And although no connection was ever shown, we now have this whole body of evidence supporting that vaccine safety that we didn't have before. And I would say, finally, dissent can also play an important role in kind of correcting biases or assumptions. It was long held that smoking was had no health risks. That was partly because a lot of the research was being done by the tobacco industry, right? And so, we do have, even unconsciously sometimes, certain kinds of biases. The history of science also hasn't always been representative, right, of women, of people of color. And so sometimes, even consensus views are neglecting certain nuances because of the ways that things have been studied or because of unconscious bias. So dissenting views can really play an important role in trying to combat some of that.
So, you've highlighted a lot of really positive ways in which dissent informs science and challenges research. But is it possible that dissenting views can also have a negative effect on science or public perception of science?
So yes, um, yes. So dissenting views can also have negative consequences, right? We've seen this in multiple instances. Vaccine hesitancy is one of them, where oftentimes the dissenting views get much more attention, and especially within certain pockets, like certain pockets of social media, where they then get traction with certain groups or subgroups that then lead them to either both there's epistemic harms. It leads to them believing things that are false. It can also lead to social harms because it can reduce vaccination rates. We've seen a resurgence of measles, for example, globally, and in places that it was once eradicated, right? And so it can certainly impact public health. It can impact people that are vulnerable. And this has also happened in cases like climate change, where you have some very powerful people with a lot of resources that can really give a lot of, can disseminate to a very high degree dissenting views, and either make them seem like they're more common than they are, right? So make it seem like, oh, I guess the scientists disagree about this because some people say this and some people say that. And so it can create confusion, both about the state of the science as well as just, what people ought to believe.
Then, in what instances do we have normatively appropriate dissent and normatively inappropriate dissent?
So, normatively appropriate dissent is what Immaculata de Martine and I refer to as that is dissent that has no epistemic value whatsoever. So that even if it's false, so it's different than just like ungrounded dissent or, dissent that's false. Um, Normatively inappropriate dissent would be dissent that just had no epistemic value whatsoever. Now, part of our main argument in our 2018 book is that trying to pick out what criteria or what characteristics that kind of dissent has in a way that would allow us to predict what kinds of dissent is normatively inappropriate is very, very difficult. And it is because there are these cases where even dissent that was, you know, potentially had bad motivations behind it, was driven by these powerful interests, um, turned out to be valuable in some way.
So, let me ask you then, what does it mean for something to have epistemic value?
Well, I think that in order for something to have epistemic value, it has to contribute to our knowledge producing practices in some ways. In this respect, we have kind of like John Stuart Millian views that even dissent that turns out to be false can help us epistemically because it can either, like the example I gave with the research about autism, it can give us new justifications for beliefs that we already held, even if it doesn't change. In some cases, it can change the consensus view. That is, it can help us achieve knowledge that we thought we had, but we didn't really have. And it can correct for biases. So it can allow us to correct or get new data that we didn't have. It can help us minimize certain influences. And all of that helps us in our knowledge producing enterprises, particularly in the long run, right? But I think what's tricky is that a lot of this dissent, it also is having pretty bad consequences as well.
Have you seen a particular effect or a difference in dissent before COVID, during COVID, and now in this post COVID phase?
Well, I do see some differences. As I mentioned, I think COVID was a trickier case because it didn't involve a well established scientific consensus about much of anything at the beginning. There were lots and lots of scientific disagreements early on about um, whether or not, for example, COVID was like the flu, like influenza in a variety of ways, whether it might impact children more or whether as an influenza, children tend to be a kind of disease vector, right? So would that be also the case here? There was disagreements about whether it was spread through mostly droplets, right? Or surface contacts. I remember disinfecting all my groceries for a while, right? It turned out that was probably in vain. And or through coughing or sneezing. So might things like standing 6 feet apart be effective, or is it the case, as probably now there would be a greater consensus about now, is it airborne, such that there are particles that potentially linger in the air, even if someone's not directly coughing or sneezing on you, which might mean that other policies like renovating our HVAC systems and making sure windows are open and that sort of thing might be more effective. So I do think that in COVID, COVID was sort of unique in that it was a time of significant scientific uncertainty about multiple things. And there was lots of early disagreement. And even, now we're seeing some evolution. So there was a scientific consensus that happened right around the first approval, the emergency FDA approval in the U.S., the equivalent emergency authorization in Europe and some other countries of the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccine. But we also saw things like, we saw that the Johnson and Johnson vaccine was creating potentially increased risks of blood clots, especially in women over 50. There was a lot of panic about that, and whether or not that was a big deal, or exactly who might be at risk. So I think that during the context of COVID, there was a lot of genuine scientific disagreement. But then the other thing that happened is that perhaps because of that, some of that uncertainty, perhaps because of some of the inevitable policy mistakes that were made when you're in conditions of uncertainty, that a lot of that was really exploited, and particularly through various online platforms, to raise more serious issues about vaccine hesitancy, or concerns about vaccine in particular. Because now we're seeing not just COVID vaccine hesitancy, but we're seeing increased hesitancy of other kinds of, especially pediatric vaccines. Now, I also think that that this actually helps demonstrate one of the things that Inma and I have argued for in our work, which is that it's not just the dissent itself that's problematic, but the conditions in which the dissent happens, right? So part of the problem is that, in some instances, missteps, mistakes, or even just, we all think of this as part of the scientific process when there's no consensus, but were perceived in ways that in some instances and with some populations kind of undermined trust in science and in organizations such in the US, the Center for Disease Control. And the problem is that once trust starts getting eroded, then it makes people question all kinds of things, right? Then they no longer trust the CDC, and not just about the COVID vaccine, but about the MMR vaccine, or about Lyme disease, or about various other health recommendations that they might make. And the World Health Organization, had some similar challenges with that. So, I think that, the COVID pandemic has been a tricky time because it's high scientific uncertainty, and a time where people are exploiting dissent. And in some instances, people have this lack of trust, which then manifests as, resistance to certain public health recommendations.
So you started by talking about scientific disagreement, for example, understanding the mechanism with which COVID propagates and infects others, and then talked about how dissent can happen outside of science, and how, for example, online platforms can amplify that disagreement, that dissent, and how that might have implications for trust in science. Can you speak a bit about how scientists maybe perceive dissent outside of science?
Well, so one thing that might be helpful is thinking about this distinction that various philosophers of science and epistemology have raised between what we might call warranted epistemic trust and unwarranted epistemic trust. And so when we think about trust in particular with respect to and how dissent might impact that, or how dissent might impact whether people are likely to trust, for example, recommendations or the source of those recommendations. In some instances, certainly disagreement that arises outside of science, that's kind of posited by non-experts, or that might be completely unfounded. So, for example, I think one of the theories that went around for a while is that the COVID vaccine would cause you to be magnetized, your body to be magnetized. I know that Inma also talked about the example of the conspiracy theory that the COVID vaccine contains a microchip that then will allow the government to track all of us. So those are, I think, what I would want to call sort of non-expert dissent, and some of those things probably create warranted distrust, or they tend to reinforce warranted distrust of the government or of experts or of particular scientists. I think we saw that with a lot of the public health experts in the US, that they were attacked, right? Sometimes quite personally, right? Conspiracy theories that COVID was started by Anthony Fauci in some lab in China, right? And it's always tricky because some of those conspiracy theories always have teeny tiny, sometimes little grains of truth. I mean, I didn't pick the best examples to show that, but they can resonate with people. But in those cases, I would say that leads to sort of unwarranted distrust of experts. And so what we do about that is one question, and it's a very difficult, right? It seems also like a sort of interdisciplinary question. Like we might need some other social science work from psychology and from a variety of things to think about how do we encourage rationality, or what can we do to make social media algorithms less problematic, or how do we sort of de-silo this kind of technology. But there's another issue at stake here, which is that, in fact, some groups, and in some instances, have good reason not to trust science. And, one very obvious example would be African Americans, Native Americans, where there's a very long, sad history of researchers that have, used and abused people in various ways, that such that those populations have good reason, right, not to trust either science, or in some cases even particular scientific institutions. And there's other reasons that potentially give people good reason not to trust science. So, such as the fact of the increasing commercialization of science and the increasing prevalence of conflicts of interest. And indeed, in COVID, I mean, one of the things that some people have been concerned about are the extent to which these vaccine companies like Pfizer and Moderna are profiting, and profiting off of, the kind of multiple booster strategy that has made people wonder, is this really, or is getting additional boosters really going to give me increased protection, or is that just, to line the pockets of pharmaceutical companies? And then, of course, it doesn't help if some of our regulating institutions contain, people who also themselves have ties to some of those companies. Now, I'm not meaning to make any negative claims about either the COVID vaccine or boosters or Pfizer or Moderna, but the problem is that this is all happening. This dissent is happening in a context where some people have some good reason to be suspicious about those kind of things. So, so the issue is, and one that I think philosophers of science can focus on, and that scientists can focus on, is how, at the very least, can we facilitate warranted trust in science, so that when some of these kind of, dissenting views arise, people feel that they can at least trust what experts and expert institutions tell them. And so that's a very different kind of solution that's required than, how do we deal with conspiracy theorists on social media?
So, given the existence of distrust in science, how should dissent be treated?
One of the things that we've argued for is what we shouldn't be doing to try to facilitate warranted trust in science is the suppressing, silencing, or sort of targeting dissent. So it is very tempting in some of these instances to think that, when dissent arises against a consensus view, what we ought to do is either ignore them, right, or suppress them, right, keep them out of the way, and certainly not sort of respond to them, not take them seriously. In some cases, various scholars have kind of targeted the dissenters, right? By showing that they themselves have financial conflicts or are problematic in some other way, that their expertise isn't there. And part of the problem is when you already have sort of, fragile trust or some distrust in science, that when you engage in silencing dissent, suppressing dissent, hiding dissent, targeting dissent, that what happens is that it actually makes lay people often more suspicious of science, of scientists. It creates this impression that scientists are somehow afraid of genuine debate and criticism, that they don't want to be criticized, and that also can facilitate, it can also lead to distrust of science, because then people wonder, well, what are they afraid of? And that perhaps they are more dogmatic and clinging to certain conclusions regardless of what the evidence is. So that's not what's happening usually. But that the fear is that's the impression it's going to give to people. So silencing dissent, even dissent we might think is somewhat problematic, can actually be rather dangerous, in that it may deprive us of those epistemic benefits we talked about earlier, but also it can also lead to more distrust of science.
So, on the subject of facilitating warranted trust, are there proposed solutions that might help to bolster trust, might help to make institutions and science itself more trustworthy?
Yes, though I will emphasize it needs to be a multifaceted approach, and it is not easy. And unfortunately, it's not easy because, once public trust is lost, or once trust in science or scientific institutions is lost, it's very difficult to sort of get that back. Um, but I think some of the policies that I've recommended, and that Ina and I have recommended in some of our work, are things like, so I'll start with the two that I mentioned. One is addressing in more potentially effective ways financial conflicts of interest in science. Now, there's a variety of proposals about how specifically we might do that, whether it's increasing public funding. In the case of drug testing, I think Julian Reese has a really excellent proposal where he talks about we could create an agency where drugs could be independently tested, and the pharmaceutical companies would pay to have their drug tested for approval, but the researchers wouldn't know which pharmaceutical company something's coming from. So doing sort of things that might address at different levels conflicts of interest would be helpful. And then, I also mentioned, we have lots of groups that have potentially good reason to be vaccine hesitant. And so one of the things we learned from COVID, although some of us, argued for this pre-COVID, is that, that this is one of the reasons why diversity and equity and inclusivity is so important to science. We need diverse people who are researchers and who are involved in these projects. We need diverse people who are a part of public health from different races and ethnicities, different genders, different geographical areas, different, geographical experiences, because people tend to build relationships and listen more and trust more people who they have certain things in common with. And so, we need a variety of policies within science and scientific institutions that really enable and value the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusivity in doing science and in doing public health. And so those are two things. There's others I can talk about, but those at least address two of the issues I raised.
With both multi level solutions being proposed and things like diversity, equity, and inclusion being pointed to as ways to create an environment for science that's more conducive to producing a science that's beneficial to a broader public, that sounds like a lot of work to do. So, how do you see,
Yeah.
for example, philosophers and society members more broadly being involved in that process?
Well, I think a lot of these changes do have to happen at the level of institutions. So they're not going to be something that's done just by like individual researchers on their own, right? So I think that that a lot of these changes would have to happen at the institutional level, scientific funding organizations, universities, perhaps at the level of state or federal governments. Um, but I do think that philosophers of science can play a role in calling attention to and doing more research on things like what facilitates warranted trust, what might prevent unwarranted distrust, and sort of to help kind of inform some of those policies that might happen.
Well, with that work for us as philosophers to do, I think that's a good place to end our interview. Thank you so much for speaking with us, Professor Intemann. It was insightful and, again, puts our theory into practice.
Thank you so much.